on the moon. In 1945, World War II had just ended and there was two nukes dropped on Japan by USA. And when those two nukes were dropped, the Soviet Union and USA were racing to get more land from Japan. And then they noticed half of the world was capitalist and another half of the world was communist. This caused them to make a race called the space race from 1950 to 1972. In 1951, the Soviet Union launched the first spacecraft, Sputnik 1. It got to an altitude of 139 kilometers above the Earth's surface and went 39 kilometers into deep space. Then, Luna 2 was launched by the Russians. Again, in 1952, that got to an altitude of 1,435 kilometers of the Earth's surface. This caused the Americans to be very angry and they also wanted their people to go into space. In 1957, the first American to land go in space, Charles Edison, spent 15 hours in space. Then, the first man in space. Before that, the first man in space, Yuguchi Gagarin, was the first man in space sent by the Soviets. He spent in space about 20 hours in space. Then, in 1959, NASA was created, and instead of the NAAA of the US's Space Department, it was changed to NASA. And then the first crewed mission to the moon started in 1962 called A3735. And the three astronauts were kept in a training capsule for 10 to 50, 50 to 60 minutes before launch. But because there was a little bit fuel in that cabin, there was a fire, and those three spacecrafts and the space astronauts died because of the fire. The pressure was so hot that the door burst open and they all died. So, in honor of those three people, the name was changed to Apollo 1. There was no Apollo 2 or Apollo 3. Then the Apollo 4 was a test flight that got to 1,489 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Then it continued from Apollo 5 to Apollo 10. They were all test flights, and they started on Apollo 11, which would land the first humans on the moon. On June 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket was launched. It created 13,000 to 18,000 kilonewtons of liftoff. So much this work almost was seen by every person in the city, in the Kennedy Space Center, Florida. 3 days later, when they arrived to the moon, Neil Armstrong had a problem. The landing switch was broken because of their spacesuits were too big. The landing switch was broken. They tried to land the spacecraft without the landing switch, but it wouldn't work. Then they tried using a pen, and it worked. The landing switch safe. The lander safely landed on the moon and sent the famous message to the Kennedy Space Center. The Eagle has landed, referring to the command module and the lander module as Eagle. And Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and said, "That's one small step for a man and one huge leap for mankind." 20 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined in. And then, above the two astronauts, there was another astronaut, and which name is forgotten by many. Michael Collins was orbiting in the command module, flying over the astronauts, taking pictures, and he had done the most spacewalks in history. He done about 18 spacewalks. Then at 10:19 p.m. Earth time, the astronauts again launched back to the Earth and safely docked to the command module. Then the service module was expelled and was purposely crashed into the moon. Or 3 days later, they entered the Earth's atmosphere and then entered the heat shield module. The three astronauts got into the heat shield module and safely returned to the Earth. The heat shield module was there because when you come below the atmosphere and when you descend down, it causes air resistance, and this air resistance causes heat, and this heat could easily burn the astronauts. So the heat shield module was also there. And on July 27th, 1969, the astronauts safely landed back on Earth and landed in water. And this water landing is called splashdown. They were in quarantine for 3 days as they were exposed to spatial viruses which were not identified by humans. Then they were released. Thank you.